While some argue that nuclear weapons allow for governments to deter conflict and reinforce national borders, Ms. Beatrice Fihn has been fighting as the Executive Director of the campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, as she believes that the risk of nuclear use is as high as ever, and that we are inching ever closer to a nuclear war. In 2017, she accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of ICAN for their efforts to raise awareness about the possible catastrophic humanitarian consequences of these devices. With over a decade of experience in disarmament diplomacy and civil society mobilization, Ms. Fihn has been leading the global campaign's push for a treaty-based prohibition of these devices. We are fortunate enough to have her here today, where she will be helping us understand the economic implications of nuclear weapons. I now present Ms. Beatrice Fihn.
Thank you very much, and it's such a great honor to be here. I'm really hoping that it's not too of a depressing topic to talk about nuclear weapons on a Friday night. So it's really, really great. And thank you so much for inviting me to join you here today. My name is Beatrice. I am the Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And we are really a global coalition. We're not one NGO. We actually are a group of NGOs, over 600 organizations in 108 countries. So this is really a massive network of committed and passionate activists, campaigners, advocates, researchers, scientists that are working to ban and eliminate nuclear weapons. And it's really a campaign based on the experiences and lessons learned from a lot of other civil society movements, and particularly the campaign to ban landmines that was really massive in the 90s, the Cluster Munitions Coalition, for example, other campaigns that have banned weapons with indiscriminate harm towards civilians based on the sort of humanitarian law and the laws of war. And I want to start a little bit by talking about, one of my favorite aspects of this work is often getting to meet and speak to incredible young people whose voices we in particular need in these quite challenging and difficult times. And I have to be honest, most of my days are quite often spent meeting with a completely different generation, usually older, usually men, who are very good at telling ICAN and us what cannot be done. And these are often the men that make decisions every day over the fate of all of our lives. But it's really not those men who will save the world in the end. It's regular people. And for all the generations, the status quo is very often presumed to be correct. But what I really like about talking to young people is that the status quo is never actually the preferred option. And these, usually men, of power very often, and the traditional patriarchal power of politicians, corporations, institutions, in reality actually far less power than what a lot of young people actually possess, the power to believe that it can be done. And the suggestion is very often that young people are naive, but I find that quite ridiculous. And the truth is that young people simply refuse to accept the way that things are, or to give up on the way that they could be. For example, older generations see the massive economic transformation necessary to stop climate change as too hard, too unrealistic, too uncomfortable. But I think most young people see it as inevitable. It has to be done. For all the generations, the idea that countries that stand for liberty and democracy would daily threaten to mass murder millions or hundreds of thousands of civilians with nuclear weapons is not weird. It's just the way things are. And even if they don't like nuclear weapons, they just think that they are an unavoidable part of life. But that really is unacceptable. And young people have every right to stand up and fight for the world they want to live in, and not just accept what is left to them. The realities around nuclear weapons is that any use of nuclear weapons would cause catastrophic humanitarian impact. It might kill not just hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions in very heavily populated areas, but the use of many nuclear weapons could trigger a global famine, the lowering of Earth's temperature, for example, and starve up to billions more, poison communities for decades. And people, regular people, have every right to use their voice to end this threat to all of us. And our world celebrates and relishes youth in many ways, but not when it comes to power and change. In this moment, when the world can feel extremely scary, intimidating, young people are saying that we can let other people decide what the future will look like, or if there will be a future at all. But I kind of want to highlight, one message that is maybe a little bit different that I probably should be saying here, and that is that one person cannot change the world. I think that's really important for us all to recognize that no one person can change the world, whether it's a regular person or a president, but we can inspire others to act. A lot of people are talking about activists like Greta Thunberg, for example, and her strike and how it's impacted the world. And of course, it was inspiring when she sat in front of the Swedish parliament on her own, undeterred. But it only became powerful and influential when all others followed and others joined her. And the reason that I think that message is so important for you as students, for example, is that, our movement in ICAN, or the ongoing fight against racism, the battle against sexism, the threat of climate change, rising inequalities, all of these causes, they need you. And they need bold and courageous leadership. But they also need organizing and a solid movement full of diverse people and diverse actors. And one of the problems is that our media, our culture of celebrity, even the way that we write history sometimes, celebrates singular figures. We are taught stories of Gandhi, of Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, all very important leaders, of course, who struggled for decades and in some cases paid with their lives. And it's not that I'm saying that these leaders don't deserve the praise that they receive, including the Nobel Peace Prize, as MLK and Mandela got. But the problem is that the part of the story that we learn and that we celebrate is the end result of that kind of activism and countless of hours of work. We learn about the success, but not the work, not the organizing, and not the so many others who stood next to them and took action and helped them. And media, and in particular social media these days, convince us that change happened through a great idea presented well, that the debate over the direction we should go as a society is decided by a well-reasoned argument or a spectacularly viral video. But it really is not. What really brings about change is collective actions of citizens and many people and organizing. And the greatest leaders of tomorrow are those that organizes those people, those that empower others to make change through actions in their communities, those that spend hours with others, helping to find and redefine their voice. And great leadership and organization and changing the world is really about service and supporting and organizing others so that they can take action, amplifying their message and prying doors open for them. And that's really some of the stories around ICAN. We decided to organize, base our arguments on facts, science, and a humanitarian perspective on nuclear weapons. It isn't just an issue about strategic stability, about vague nuclear deterrence theory, but logic and realism. Any use of nuclear weapons would have catastrophic humanitarian consequences. And there is no humanitarian relief agency, neither in one government or in the United Nations system or the ICRC or any other, that could provide adequate humanitarian relief in case of use of nuclear weapons. And looking at how the world has adapted to or tried to regulate war, we've adopted the Geneva Conventions, the laws of war, that says that you have to protect civilians in warfare. It is illegal to target civilians in warfare. And based on that, the world moved on to ban biological weapons and chemical weapons, banned landmines and cluster munitions. All of these were banned because the harm from these weapons disproportionately impacted civilians. But yet somehow we had forgotten about nuclear weapons. So what ICAN did was to organize a broad mass movement with very diverse and different actors. We have groups of doctors that are having a medical perspective on this. We have lawyers that have a legal perspective. We have lobbyists that works in parliament. We have activists that protest on nuclear bases. We have groups of nuns who chain themselves to the gates of nuclear weapons stations around the world. We have young activists that are using TikTok to organize. We have academics who write long papers. And all of these people make up this campaign based on the humanitarian consequences, based on the idea that the laws of war apply also to nuclear weapons. You are not allowed to target civilians. You're not allowed to wipe out whole cities of weapons of mass destruction. And if we keep these weapons around long enough, logic say they will eventually be used. So what we did was, based on this, what do we do with weapons that cause indiscriminate harm to civilians? Weapons that in their essence target civilians. We ban them. So we worked to rally governments around the world to negotiate, adopt the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And this treaty is modeled after the same kind of treaties that ban biological weapons, chemical weapons, landmines, cluster munitions. International law that bans this weapon for certain reasons. And this was the work that we were awarded for the Nobel Peace Prize for in 2017, for building a new norm, for working with governments around the world to shape new rules, international legal sort of norms that will eventually shape behavior. And we know that these kind of treaties work, even if not all the users or producers of the weapons are on board with the treaty first. For example, the treaties banning landmines or cluster munitions, despite not having the United States, Russia, China on board of these, the main users and producers of these weapons, they've drastically shifted how the world sees these weapons. Based on an international treaty, the production of these have dropped to almost nothing. The amount of minefields that have been cleared is massive, and the number of victims that are being harmed by these weapons have drastically reduced as well. So the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, it bans the use of nuclear weapons, the possession, the development, testing, and production. And what we're doing with this treaty now is to really bring it into force. After 50 countries ratified the treaty, which happened about a year ago, the treaty entered into force and became international law. And now we are moving on to implementing it, bringing more countries on board, but also using it as a tool for pressure, using it in the nuclear armed states to challenge and shift expectations on politicians. We're using it for companies to get them to stop producing nuclear weapons. We're using it for banks to divest from nuclear weapons. Seeing how the world throughout the pandemics has pumped money into these illegal weapons means that the treaty is an excellent starting point for challenge that. So this is all something that has been created by this movement. Nuclear weapons used to be legal and now they are illegal. So one person cannot change the world, but one committed community can. And very often when I talk to young people today, I'm so floored by the eloquent ideas, very savvy kind of political nature, complete kind of ability to see through, I can't say bullshit. And those talents can really change the world and can really shift politics. And it needs to be channeled into campaigns, into organizations, into movements that improves the world. So I would really encourage everyone to find those communities, find the people around you, find your tribe and ask them, what do you need? How do we bring more people on board and build together? Just minutes before I walked into the city hall in Oslo to accept the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of ICAN, I received a phone call from a young woman, the only teenager to ever receive the Nobel Peace Prize, Malala Yousafzai from Pakistan. And she knows that one person alone cannot change the world. Everywhere she goes, even when she accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, She brings other girls fighting for education like her with her. And she tells journalists, don't just talk to me, talk to them, hear their stories. She knows that to change the life of millions of girls around the world will take the actions of millions around the world. And when she called me just before the ceremony started, she simply said to me, enjoy it, have fun. And this is something else that they don't tell you and rarely teach in history books, because this kind of change happens in communities. It is also a lot of fun. And the people I work with for over a decade were on making this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons are today some of my best friends. And there's nothing more rewarding and frankly more fun than standing side by side with incredible people, taking on a massive threat to the world. And success is, of course, wonderful, but every step of this journey to bring about positive change is rewarding, and it's incredibly empowering. Because all of these issues that we face, and exemplified, I'd say, by nuclear weapons, are really solvable. And why? Because all of the threats we're facing today in the world are created by people, mostly old people. And these unequal power structures, global challenges, they don't just naturally emerge. People take decisions to make it dangerous, to make the world unequal, to make it more threatful, to make it more discriminating. But that also means that we can make different choices. We can choose a different path. But we will not do so if we only believe in and celebrate the power of one, but rather in the strength of many. So I think I'll stop there, and we can hopefully have a really great conversation. I'm looking forward to some questions.
Thank you for shedding some light on such a controversial topic. Our first question is, in a democratic country, it would be easier and safer to speak against nuclear weapons. How about those who are under dictatorships? How would they be able to speak up and have their voice heard?
It's a really, really good question. Just yesterday, I was actually in Lithuania meeting with Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. She is the opposition leader of Belarus. I don't know if you followed it, but there was an election, and Alexander Lukashenko is often called the last dictator of Europe, the dictator of Belarus. And she has been a human rights activist, a civil society organizer, an incredible human rights defender, and has sacrificed a lot personally. Her husband is in prison. She had to flee from Belarus after the election. That was fraudulent election, which he allegedly won, which he didn't really. And meeting her and talking, because he's now putting forward a proposal to remove Belarus, a line in Belarus constitution about being a nuclear weapon-free country, and has welcomed Russian nuclear weapons on Belarusian territory, which is of course very dangerous right now in the increasing sort of escalation and threats from Russia to invade Ukraine. And talking to her and realizing the kind of sacrifices that people like her are doing in non-democratic countries also kind of reminds us what a privilege it is to be an activist in democratic countries, and what a responsibility we have to stand in solidarity with activists and organizations and people in countries where it is not safe to speak out on these issues. So I absolutely recognize that it's incredibly difficult for people in some countries to speak out, and in particular challenge the military. We have many colleagues in countries that are not democracies that have to have a different approach to their work than we have. For example, in some non-democratic countries, they are much more scientists, doctors, and they speak from a more technical perspective, and they speak less directly opposing the countries and trying kind of different ways of doing that work. And I think that we have to respect and make sure that we don't expect people to put themselves in danger for certain causes just to kind of keep up with activists in countries where we have the privilege of being free to say whatever we want. We sometimes get that question, right, about how, oh, you only work in democratic countries, and that's not always true. Our work in democratic countries is much more visible because we can be public about it and we can put faces on it and people can speak out and say, I am believing this cause. Whereas in some other countries, it is much more of a personal risk, which means that they have to be a little bit quieter and a little bit more subtle. But I want to highlight very much that international law and norms, it impacts non-democratic countries as well. And they also join treaties because it's in their security interest to join treaties at times. And we've seen that, for example, with the treaty banning landmines or the treaty banning cluster munitions, for example. Russia, for example, never signed the treaty. They did not accept this ban, and they say that their cluster bombs are legitimate. Yet, in the conflict between in the war between Georgia and Russia many years, I think 15 years ago or something like that, Russia accused Georgia of using cluster bombs and saying these illegal weapons, kind of showing that they recognized it. I mean, I think it was Human Rights Watch who got a hold of footage from Russian state TV of Russian fighter planes going to Syria armed with cluster bombs. And when they drew attention to this and issue a press release and saying Russia is using these bombs that are prohibited by an international treaty, that footage was immediately removed and replaced with other footage of these planes that did not have these bombs on and was not visible. Now, it doesn't mean that Russia got rid of all their weapons or didn't use these illegal weapons, but it kind of shows that they're recognizing, right? And we see also with other countries how they are using excuses. We see that in Syria, for example, with chemical weapons. Syria never signed the Chemical Weapons Convention originally. So when they used chemical weapons on its own population, they lied about it and said it was the terrorists using it. Kind of recognizing that even if they hadn't joined this treaty and they were not a democracy in that way, they still felt the pressure of behaving in a certain way. Like, we can't force countries to behave. We have to pressure them into like shaping how we expect them to behave. So international law is not a foolproof, like everything is going to be fixed as soon as we have an international law, but it is the tool that we have. And we have seen from historic reason, just look at since World War II and the laws and the measures we put in place are slowly pushing governments, democratic and non-democratic countries, into a direction and kind of trying to force them as much as possible to behave in a certain way.
Thank you for that answer. I think you covered that quite broadly, which is very interesting and enlightening for us to hear about. We have a very popular question. Is it fair to stop other countries from gaining nuclear weapons when developed nations are unwilling to get rid of theirs?
I mean, this is exactly, this is correct, and really part of the problem. And it's sort of, I have 2 small kids, and sometimes I feel like the nuclear weapons issue is a little bit like, do as I say, not as I do, which never works on kids. And it is very hypocritical. And this is also one of the things that made me really fascinated with this issue. When we chatted a little bit before the broadcast started, I mentioned that I was not at all interested in nuclear weapons originally, but got sort of thrown into it and then understood the enormous hypocrisy around this issue. That we are saying that certain countries are much more dangerous with nuclear weapons than the Western countries with nuclear weapons. And you can't get away from that. There's a certain level of racism there. White Western countries are more responsible, even though the only country that has ever detonated a nuclear bomb on a civilian population is the United States. No other country has done that. But yet we kind of see them as the responsible nuclear actors, and they are the sort of legitimate nuclear states, whereas other countries would be dangerous with it. We saw that, for example, South Africa had a nuclear program. and had nuclear weapons under the apartheid regime.
Yes.
And sometimes we have this kind of idea that, you know, the ANC came in and they got rid of nuclear weapons, and that, you know, in order to be not a pariah state, but accepted by the international community. But it was actually the apartheid regime that started the process of getting rid of nuclear weapons, because they knew they had to hand over the power to ANC. And they were not comfortable having a black government with nuclear weapons, an African like government with nuclear weapons in that way. And I think that that really is sort of a something we have to reflect on. And that's very much why ICAN has said that there are no right hands for the wrong weapons. The danger isn't a certain country with nuclear weapons. The danger is the weapon. No country has the right to be able to like end life on Earth as we know it. No individual. I mean, I did not trust Donald Trump, but I don't trust Joe Biden with that either. I don't trust Putin with that. I don't trust Kim Jong-un. It doesn't matter who they are. Nobody should have the power to end the entire world as we know it with just a few minutes of decision-making time for themselves. In the United States, the president alone has the power to use nuclear weapons. And that was terrifying. And it was terrifying to Americans. So the fact that like Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, during those crazy days at the end of the Trump presidency, when there was a riot in the on the Capitol Hill, for example, she called like the generals in the military and said, "Can you promise me to not authorize nuclear weapons if he wants to use them?" And that is basically asking the military to do a coup. Like, and it just shows what an incredibly unsafe system this is. So I very much agree that it is very hypocritical to say to some countries you can't have it, and to others you can have it. But our solution is not let everyone have it, but our solution is, of course, that nobody should have these weapons.
I see. So would you say that in the case of South Africa, like you mentioned, the only way for some countries to give up their nuclear weapons would be in the situation where they know they're going to give up power?
No, I don't think so. And we also seen other examples, of course, with countries that had maybe not a fully fledged nuclear weapons program, but was researching and preparing to have nuclear weapons. My own country, I'm Swedish originally. Sweden had a nuclear weapons program in the 60s. It never went fully operational into nuclear warheads, but it was a part of the Swedish sort of Cold War thinking. We were not part of NATO. We were not part of the Eastern Bloc. We're a neutral state. Do we need to have nuclear weapons to protect ourselves? But of course, the ability to mass murder maximum amount of civilians is not power. It's one type of power, very limited power, but there are other ways of power and other ways of shaping the world. And I really do believe that, for example, multilateralism and economics, culture is also ways to shaping the world. And I think that we can see that this soft power is just as influential and is just as much able to shape the world. I mean, it's not a coincidence that we're seeing the Chinese government right now on display with the Olympics, for example. It's another form of shaping and using power and using other ways to influence and get what you want in a way. So I think that the idea that weapons, nuclear weapons in particular, is the kind of like the main source of power is very outdated and it's an idea from 1945. It's not something for the 21st century.
Thank you for that. Our next question is, can civil disobedience movements have an actionable impact on the production of nuclear weapons, given the secrecy and power gap governing nuclear programs?
Great question. Yes, I mean, we believe in nonviolence, of course, but there are many examples of really incredible activists that have used civil disobedience. And I was talking a little bit earlier about these nuns. We have these fantastic, they are like 60, 70, 80 years old, nuns who break into nuclear bases in the US and, put a spotlight on what they think is immoral, unethical, kind of mass murdering, violating of law kind of weapons. So I think that that's definitely a really amazing way. There are many different ways of working. I think it's really important to be in any movement that we are a bit humble and don't say this is the only way and this is the way that things are going to be fixed, because there is no one way. I think we have to employ a lot of different methods and a lot of different measures, and that's why I'm so passionate about ICAN's kind of coalition model, where you gather different types of organizations in different countries with different methods, different audiences. We have Catholic church groups, we have scientists, we have youth activists, we have students, we have professors, like, and trying to, everyone has their own audience and everyone has their own method. So I really do think that we need to employ different ways, and by working together in a broad coalition where everyone has the same goal but uses their own methods, and civil disobedience can be a really effective methods. And I'm also a big fan of working to kind of oppose not just the nuclear armed states. It's very easy in the nuclear weapons field to think about the 9 leaders of the nuclear armed states as the only people who can change this, forgetting things like the weapons companies, for example, or the banks that lend money. In the US, for example, we found 50 universities, UCL, MIT, who are involved in building nuclear weapons. University of California has been involved in building every single American nuclear weapon that exists. And to be sort of like identifying these different actors that are part of the problem and also part of upholding this kind of structural problems is really important, and start protesting that in many different ways, from the inside, from the outside. I don't believe in that we have to choose, or that we have to say this is the only way or that is the only way. I believe in that everyone should do what makes sense to them and what their skills are and what their audience is. It's like a little bit like I talked to a friend who's a personal trainer about what's the best, most effective like workout, and he's like, whichever one that you show up and do. And I think that it's a little bit the same thing with activism and political things. Like whatever it is that you feel like you can contribute with is the best for you. It doesn't mean that everyone has to do that, and it doesn't mean that it's the only one. But if you're an artist and you want to do this kind of work through communicating art, then do that. If you're a lawyer, then do that. If you're a doctor, then do that. And to figure out like this, where do I fit into this bigger movement, and how can I contribute with my special skills and with my role and my audience and my network that I have. So yeah, I do think that at times you need people who are willing to put themselves on the line a little bit. It's not for everyone, and not everyone has to do it, but I think it's definitely a very important part of it.
That was such an inspirational answer. Thank you for that. I think it's so prevalent, especially during this time as we're struggling through the COVID-19 pandemic, that people like you remind us that it's only through working together and bringing different groups and peoples with different skills together that we can truly accomplish something meaningful. I have another question on a similar route. What inspired you to taking up activism, and more particularly the anti-nuclear weapons movement? I know we spoke about this previously, but
yeah, I mean, I think I've always been a big believer in organizing and doing things. I think I grew up in a family where my parents were part of local school boards, and they were active in sports associations, and they were active in all of these like small gatherings that some of them had a political objective, and some of them were just a societal group kind of thing. But being around a lot of organizations and a lot of communities that got together, and I think that we live in an extremely individualistic world at the moment, where we are our own personal brands even, and we are sort of very much focused on ourselves, and we're forgetting to gather in groups and change things, and almost like we are consuming society, that if we're not happy with something, we change instead of changing what we're not happy with. That we are like, okay, if I'm not happy with my school, I will go to another school, instead of like, well, let's fix this school. So I think that we need to really kind of, so I grew up in a family where it was very natural to be a part of organizations, and I was always very interested. I also grew up in Sweden, in an area with a lot of people from all over the world. It's one of those areas where I think we have two people in my class who had parents born in Sweden. Everyone else was born from all over the world. And we had a lot of refugees in the end of the 90s from the Balkans and the Balkan War, from Eritrea and Somalia, from Iran, from Chile, from all of these places around the world that had a kind of a conflict or a famine or a, civil war. And I think that I just at an early stage was really understanding that what happened in Iran with the revolution, like that was my best friend was, came from there and fled with her family, and it impacted me as well. And what happened in the Balkans, I remember finding it so complicated as like, what was I, 7 or 8 during the Balkans War or something like that. And I was like, okay, so there's Bosnians and there's Serbians and there's Croatians and there's Kosovo Albanians, and I don't understand, like, who's the good guys and who are the bad guys? I couldn't figure it out. And being sort of exposed to that, and like having all of these kids coming to my school and being my friends from these backgrounds, just also kind of made me understand how connected we are, and what happened on the other side of the world impacted Sweden, even if we had no kind of part of that conflict. So to me, that really grew a sense of interest in these questions. And then I got into nuclear weapons by complete accident. I did an internship. I was studying international relations at Stockholm University, and I was looking for an internship because that's what I heard that you have to do in order to get a job. So I got an internship, and they asked me if I wanted to go to Geneva and work on the nuclear disarmament program. And I thought it sounded so boring. How was this relevant? Nuclear weapons is like a Cold War relic. Like, do they even exist? I wanted to do human rights. But I did it anyway because it was a paid internship and you don't say no to that. So I did it and was completely fascinated and just really taken by how the things that I was passionate about, human rights, peace and security, gender equality, how I could see how this issue was so connected to all of these things. And it was not actually a lot of people think that nuclear weapons is like an isolated issue, kind of disconnected from everything else, but it's really not. It's ingrained, it's a way of oppression and a way of inequality. These first 5 countries, and 9 of them, that have this power to end us all, and we just are supposed to accept it, the rest of us, and just be at their mercy. So for me, it was just, I understood how much of a international justice and equality issue it was. And I think that's how I got stuck, almost, if I can say, with this issue.
Wow, thank you. Following on from that response, someone has a question about your campaigning process, your work with ICAN. Someone asked, many stakeholders were involved in your campaigning process. Were there instances when it was hard to come to a consensus, and how did you reconcile them?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, working with people in communities is amazing and absolutely awful sometimes. I mean, I love them all, but it's like lots of different peoples, and everyone has their own vision and their own preference and their own strategy, and a lot of egos. And this is not exclusive for this issue, right? It's everywhere. Like, you can find that these dynamics, and anywhere you have to work together with people. And I think, of course, also, what the difference is between in a civil society movement versus maybe a corporate environment is that we really want to be inclusive, which means that there is less hierarchy and less a top-down kind of this is the deal, like, and if you don't like it, you're fired. Like, we don't work like that. So it's a lot of volunteers, a lot of engagement, and people have their own kind of, they are there, like, you're not hiring them in the same way. So there's I think in civil society movements, there's a lot of work and sort of communicative work on bringing people together. One way I think we've done to, because I can see that in the climate change movement, for example, also very different approaches and different opinions, and sometimes you can spend almost all your time on kind of internal debates and not so much external, the people you actually have to convince in the end. So what we try to do, like this kind of coalition model, is that everyone is still their own organization. So we have these 600 NGOs, and instead of creating a super organization and everyone is a member and they sign off on everything, we're trying to be as coordinated and organized, but still open and flexible. So they are all their own organizations. So we have, for example, an organization like Greenpeace that's a part, but it doesn't mean that Greenpeace like have to agree with everything. They kind of sign on to this broad objective of banning and eliminating nuclear weapons based on their kind of catastrophic humanitarian impact. And we in the staff team in ICAN, we kind of support all of these organizations with resources, updates, but each of them, they have their own profile, their own aim, their own audience, their own funds. And for me, that has been a way to kind of not have to force everyone to do the same and to kind of like actually reap the benefits of being diverse. So Greenpeace, they will do the environmental arguments and they have the audience for that, and it's great. And the doctors, they will have the medical and you know, trying to see that. And the same thing with the regional diversity. We have lots of organizations in Africa, for example. They are the ones who will be the ones who campaign in Africa. It's not like I, a Swede based in Switzerland, will come in and say, here's what you're going to do in Nigeria. Like, it's not my job, and they know the context better there. So there's a lot of coordination, and that requires a lot of work to keep everyone updated, but also a lot of trust in that people and organizations will come up with their own messaging and their own arguments that work best in their context, and to have a little bit of a faith that it will come together in the end as a broad movement. But I have to, you know, it is a challenge. And I don't think it's unique for civil society. It's challenging to work with people in general, especially many people, and especially when you want something very specific. So my advice to anyone who's working like this is to figure out sort of what is absolutely necessary to agree and what can be a bit flexible, and to try to kind of not control too much, because that will just lead to too much internal negotiations and fights, and try to figure out how everyone can do their things and be valued for their own contributions, so that everyone feels worthy and respected and part of it. But still that there is some sense of direction where everyone is going towards the same goal.
Wow. While it is quite challenging, it is so meaningful that these people with different agendas can really come together and achieve their own goals, and yet achieve a greater goal. I think that's quite inspiring. Leading on from the inspiration part of that, someone has a question. They asked, how can we connect and inspire youth to be anti-war and anti-nuclear weapons in cases of warmongering among youth by governments or regional politics?
Absolutely. And I think the sort of anti-war movement has really been too quiet. And I think that there's been a reluctance to question the military, not just in non-democratic countries, but also in many democratic countries, that you're seen as naive or illoyal or somehow weak if you are questioning the military. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we've gone through 2 years of the pandemic, and the military spending in the world has just kept increasing. And you see in, so for example, the United States, where they rejected things like paid parental leave. They didn't cancel student debt, for example. They don't have healthcare for everyone, yet they just signed blank checks to the military with massive investments. And you can see, for example, how the current Secretary of Defense of the United States was the CEO. No, he was on the board of Raytheon, one of the big weapons companies. And you know, it's this kind of circle of the same people going in and out. So I really think that we have to question the weapons industry, the kind of military-industrial complex, follow the money always. I think that's really, really important. What we've seen also, for example, we published some research in June last year on how much governments are spending on nuclear weapons, and it's something like 73 or 74 billion dollars in 2020. During a pandemic, they spent it on weapons that they say they can't use because they are not supposed to be used. And it's just like the amount of lives that could have been saved with that money. and the amount of healthcare and education and development that you can use. And that's just the nuclear weapons part. And the military budget is, I mean, it's something like over $1 trillion a year. It's absolutely massive. And when the real crisis came, a virus, right? Like the military was useless. So they had all this money. We had to spend all this thing to protect people. Yet, who really helped and protected people? It was nurses and doctors and grocery store workers and delivery people and janitors and people who kept society kind of rolling in this crisis. And we will just see that continue. I mean, climate change, you are not going to be able to deter climate change with nuclear weapons, right? Like it's a new types of threats that are moving across borders, that are completely different from this kind of World War II scenarios. Yet we're somehow, our decision makers are stuck in that kind of past, in a very sort of old-fashioned way of thinking. So I do think we need to be able to speak out on this sort of anti-war, anti-military, and not anti-military, but like anti sort of the excessive military spending. I don't mean that you have to be completely against all defense, right? It's just the sort of, there's no proportionality at the moment in our budgets. There's the amount of money that goes to weapons is, and it feeds, of course, a more of a need for more weapons of others, and it's just like a vicious circle. And I think the best way of doing that is to really connect weapons and war to other issues that people care about, connected to climate change, connected to gender equality, connected to racism. It's not a coincidence which countries we go to war in, and the situation, like, and who is being impacted by these conflicts. It's very connected to lack of privilege. I mean, for example, just the kind of, a lot of people talk about how nuclear weapons have kept us safe, completely disregarding how over 2,000 nuclear weapons were tested around the world. And these were tested on colonies, indigenous people's land. I mean, and very systematically, all of the examples. The United States tested in Nevada and New Mexico on indigenous people's land on Marshall Islands, a Pacific Islands state that they occupied and colonized. France tested in Algeria and in the French Polynesia. The United Kingdom tested on Aboriginal land in Australia. Soviet tested in Kazakhstan. China tested on Uyghur land. I mean, where they have concentration camps, for example, and the Muslim population. It's like completely systematic where you have tested, and on people that they didn't care about. So when you say that nuclear weapons protected us, it doesn't protect the people in Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan today, for example, who 1 out of 20 children born there today in this region in Pakistan, in Kazakhstan, is born with a disease traced to nuclear testing. The women in Marshall Islands that are giving birth to stillborn babies or having miscarriages because of radioactive impacts, and the many cancer cases in the United States, for example, that can be traced to the nuclear testing. It didn't protect them. So I think that we have to be able to look at the anti-war and the kind of security issues and connect it with other issues that people feel closer about. That isn't, because I absolutely can sympathize with people. Nuclear weapons can be a very hard issue to think about because it's so distant. So, but it's when we break it down and talk about it in those terms that we can connect with other movements. I really do believe that intersectional movements, where we look at issues from different angles and we stand in solidarity with each other, is really the way forward for a lot of these issues and movements.
Thank you for that. Wow. Our next question, someone asked, we rely on international efforts to pressurize states into removing nuclear weapons. Do you think homegrown activism can have the same impact?
Absolutely. At the end of the day, I think that's what's really going to change it. And I think that the international pressure, I mean, it's like everything matters, right? So if you're in a country that doesn't have nuclear weapons, then you have a job to get your country to pressure those that have. And if you're in a country that has nuclear weapons, you have a job to pressure your own government. And we see that in the United Kingdom, for example, the people of Scotland are very much opposing nuclear weapons, which is quite interesting to think about, right? Like it's not a big country, like geographically, right? And how come that people in this area don't like nuclear weapons and don't feel like they protect them, and the people in this area down south feel like they are very needed? It cannot be just geography. It cannot. It also has a way of like a perspective and a cultural impact. So I think that people, for example, and here we have again maybe a tie back to colonialism, where people in Scotland feel like, well, it wasn't our decision to put the nuclear submarines here. If something goes wrong, we are the ones who are going to be dying, not the people in London. And for example, if you remove nuclear weapons from Scotland, I mean, I know that it talks about, for example, another referendum on independence for Scotland. If Scotland would be an independent country and get rid of nuclear weapons, the United Kingdom's government has even said that they have no place they don't even know where to put them. They have no other place in the UK to put these weapons and put these bases for the submarines. So it's really, the people of Scotland and people in the United Kingdom has a massive power and can really change the whole situation. Because at the end of the day, especially in democracies, these people want to be re-elected. And if we make it an issue, and if we start shifting the debate and start shifting the way we think, and maybe it can feel too late with the current prime minister or president in these countries, but the next generation of politicians can be challenged now and can be, part of a cultural shift. Things that seemed really impossible 20, 30 years ago are suddenly normal. And it might seem kind of crazy at first, but it can also happen very, very fast.
Thank you. With the way culture is changing, like you said, do you think in the near future we'll see a lot more positive shifts? Where do you see us going in the next, let's say, 10, 20 years?
It's so interesting right now, because I think that we're seeing almost these two parallel shifts. Like, we are making massive progress on some issues. And I think that the conversations around gender equality, anti-racism, diversity, I mean, it's really inspirational and it's really shifting things. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that. Yet we have very kind of polar opposite trajectory with a lot of misinformation, conspiracy theories, nationalistic sort of macho leaders. I mean, it's not a coincidence we have nuclear tensions, right? When we've had also, people like Trump and Kim Jong-un and Putin in power. So of course, there's like almost like we're almost polarizing the world in a way. And I see very positive things happening. And I think that, the work that young people are doing on climate change, for example, is so inspirational. And I always find it so incredible to see how radical they are, and really like seeing through like platitudes and seeing through kind of dishonest leaders very, very well. But it is like not a given that things will be better and better and better. I think we have to fight really hard, and I think everything is about the choices that we make. It's very hard to say, there's some extremely positive things, and I think that sometimes when you look at media, you think that everything is terrible. But I want to remind everyone that today, what we see in the news is very determined by algorithms, and what gets the most traction and most engagement. And negative news gets so much more engagement than positive. I mean, there's all the research that state this. So when we look at the news, it's not reality. There are also very, very good things happening in the world. I'm not talking, I'm not discounting the bad stuff. I mean, there's many, many bad things that are happening, but it's not all bad. But we're just quite bad at recognizing the good things and promoting it. And we take the good things for granted and kind of almost, it just happened, like that was natural. We see things, for example, women's right to vote, for example. Today we take it for granted, and we don't kind of recognize what an incredible fight it was, how much people sacrificed, how activists fought, and they were shamed, they were like ostracized from society, and like it was really not a given, right? So they fought all these things, and today we almost like, well, it would have always happened. So I think we have to remember that for all of these fights, and they feel really heavy and difficult. But once you win, even the opposition will pretend like they were the ones behind it, and everyone, yes, we always supported this. I always think about things like gay marriage, for example, that was extremely controversial just like 20, 30 years ago. And suddenly it's like, oh yeah, we've always been in favor of that. That's sort of what people in power do, right? They fight it until they lose, and then they swap sides. So we have to kind of remember that none of these things were easy, none of these things were taken for granted, and we have won a lot and really made progress, and we can do it again.
Thank you for that. I have one last question. Despite advocating for the abolition of nuclear weapons, do you believe that nuclear energy can play a part in the transition to a greener economy?
It could. I mean, I'm not an energy expert in that way. And I think it's quite important to separate the two things. A lot of people sometimes conflate the two things. But like with almost all technology, there can be a really good purpose to it, and it can be used for harm. And almost all inventions that we have today, I thought about Alfred Nobel, who is the reason for the Nobel Prize, who invented dynamite, which is a really important invention for construction and for all these things for the industry, but used for weapons as well. And same thing with nuclear, like splitting the atom was like a huge scientific achievement. And even people like Albert Einstein, who was part of that research, were like, this is amazing. And then, wait, what are they doing with it? So you can use these technologies. We see that with social media can be absolutely amazing, really great, connect with people everywhere, but can also be used for really harmful things. So I think that when it comes to nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, I think we have to separate, like one is a weapon and one is a source of energy. So there's like an inherent bad intent with one of them and an inherent good intent with the other one. I'm not saying that nuclear energy is safe or great, or I'm not saying that it's bad. We don't really have a position on nuclear energy, also to allow our partner organizations to have different opinions on that, because it's not what we campaign on. But I obviously see the massive challenge we have ahead of us in terms of energy, and fossil fuels, for example, is something we're going to have to end if we want to survive as a world, as humanity. So I'm hoping that smarter people than I have a big plan for this, but also kind of recognizing that, of course, the impact of accidents like Chernobyl, for example, has, we see the similar impact as with nuclear weapons, especially long term with cancers and things like that. So I'm not saying that it's a safe energy, but I do think we have to separate the two in terms of the thinking around our campaign.
Thank you. And on that note, I unfortunately have to end this Q&A, but it was an absolute pleasure and an inspiration to speak to you. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It was incredible to hear all you have to say.
Really, really appreciate the questions. It was great questions.
Thank you.